In a continuation of my video titled The Soldier's Lament, How Stands the Glass Around, I'd like to briefly discuss another poem and song which might further help us to understand the tragic life of the soldiery during the long 18th and 19th centuries. Der Gute Kamerad was written as poetry in 1809 and set to music a few years later. The name translates to the Good Comrade, but I'm sure many of us would know it by its first line, Ich hatt einen Kameraden, or I had a comrade. The song actually remains quite popular in Germany, commonly being played at military funerals, and it also holds some cultural significance in France, of all places, and actually a few other countries as well. The song's story is a simple one. It's of two soldiers marching alongside one another in the same rank when their unit comes under fire. One of the soldiers is struck and lays dying at his friend's feet, reaching out his hand for his comrade who cannot return this final comfort as he follows his orders to reload. It's a piece of immeasurable sorrow which, while applicable to the hardships of soldiering through all periods of time, it relates most strongly, I think, to the period of linear warfare in which it was originally authored. Sadly, it seems that here on YouTube, or at least on English-speaking YouTube, the origins of this song have been largely supplanted by a Second World War-driven narrative, and it plays host to many commemorations of, on the surface, the terrible plight, and it was terrible, of course, of the German soldiery from that period, though oftentimes these videos have other implications of far less savory and darker political and moral ideas, to say the least. But the number of Wehrmacht or even Nazi-oriented videos featuring this song on the internet aside, I'd like to get to the real heart of the song and to the historical context which actually surrounds it. As with my previous video, I'll read off the lyrics, in English of course, that they might be considered within their own light, before playing a rendition of the song, and then offering a short discussion on it. Naturally, there are a few different ways of translating the German, and I went with a translation which I think most appropriately reflects the literal meaning as well as the musical flow of the words. And so we have Der Gute Kamerad. I once had a comrade, one better you couldn't find. The drum beats a battle, and he went at my side, in the same step and pace. A bullet came flying, meant for me or meant for you. He was torn away, and he lies at my feet, as if he were a part of me. He still reaches out his hand to me. While I reload, I cannot give you my hand. Rest you in eternal life, my good comrade. Keeping this narrative in mind, I now invite you, dear viewer, to listen to a full rendition of this song in its original German, where I think the fuller emotions might better be felt. This rendition is a bit less common on the English-speaking side of YouTube, with most versions being an older, presumably Second World War recording, as befitting the context in which it is often placed. I'm afraid I don't actually know the proper source of this rendition, although if it is ever pointed out to me, I'll be sure to leave a note in the description box as always. It's a simple rendition with very few instruments and a slow, emotional voice, one which I can always imagine belonging to a lone man recalling his loss and fighting back his tears just as he was forced to fight off the entreaties of his fallen brother. Again, we have Der Gute Kamerad. Gilt sie mir oder gilt sie There are two chief ideas that I'd like to discuss in relation to this song. And the first is found in the second stanza, the line, eine Kugel kam geflogen, gilt es mir oder gilt es dir? A bullet flies towards the rank, presumably from an enemy force opposite, and our singer is plagued with a simple question. Was that fateful shot meant to kill him instead of his friend? Is the singer's survival merely up to some accident of nature which saw his comrade die bloodily at his feet? It's a question of survivor's guilt, and it's songs like this which prove to us that these issues of post-traumatic stress have always existed, whether they were acknowledged in this historical context or not. The same concept of these lingering memories, of experiences haunting our singer continually, can also be found in the third stanza with the line, will mir die Hand noch reichen, with the key word here being noch. He still reaches out his hand. Still. As if the singer continually feels the pulling at his side, the desperate last clasp of his friend whom he once strode with proudly on parade, echoing through time like some sort of phantom pain of a lost limb. Indeed, such a comparison is well worthy, I think, with the line, als wär's ein Stück von mir, as if he were a part or a piece of the singer which was torn violently away from him. Curiously, there's also an alternative translation of that second line as, is it my turn or yours, which betrays the almost numbing effect of suffering on the soldiers, surrounded as they are by death and hardship, it being just another person's time to die, another person's turn. Perhaps the bullet's intent is not to be found with a single firer on the other side, presumably one of hundreds, but with the fates themselves. And if that is indeed the case, we return to the question of survivor's guilt. Why was it their time, their turn to go? By what justice could the good comrade have fallen when, as we've learned, you couldn't ever find a better one? Why not some lesser man? Why, the singer asks himself. Why couldn't it have been me? The second thing I'd like to discuss in relation to this song is more specific in nature to the period in which it was written. Rather than drawing attention to any specific line within the text, I'd like to analyze the wider scene which it portrays, which would have been a terribly common one throughout the days of linear warfare in all its forms, from the introduction of gunpowder well through the long 19th century. Imagine, if you will, the two men are marching together, side by side in their formation, in the same step and pace. At one point they're engaged, and it's while giving fire to the enemy that the good comrade is shot. In the heat of battle, his body crumples to the ground with the shock of being struck so heavy a blow as would be delivered by a musket shot. Perhaps our singer doesn't even notice his fallen friend right away, as his entire world devolves to the almost mechanical motions of loading and firing, and all the while listening for commands through the din and the chaos of war. After all, he can hardly even see a few inches in front of him after that first volley, and his eyes and throat are stinging with the sulphurous smoke. He hears a groaning, perhaps worse even, a stifled screaming of agony, and notices that his comrade no longer occupies the space to his side. Our man's vision is drawn downwards, where the good comrade lays on the floor. His cap has fallen off and his musket's to the wayside, and he clutches with bloodied arms at his gut. We hear the screams of pain burst unwittingly from this comrade's lips, but through the chaos of beating drums and shouted orders, he cannot make out his friend's final words. He shuts his pan and casts his musket about to ram home a cartridge, all the while aware of his friend's suffering death, a simple arm's reach, and yet a full world away from him. Our man is pulling out his ramrod while his comrade reaches out with a bloodied palm in this last imploration for comfort or dignity in death. Our man cannot reach out to his friend, his good comrade. He has to reload. Another command is shouted and the force advances, leaving the good comrade behind, alone in a foreign land, to die. Such is the fate of this soldier. May he rest in the eternal life. In the days of linear warfare, this image would have been a terribly common one. If a man falls, the man behind him must immediately take up his place, and the advance must never be halted. If you're standing and firing into an enemy that's engaging you, there is no time to halt your duties for something so simple as providing comfort in death to your friend. You are specifically drilled to step over the dead and dying men, not to stop and render aid to them. Such is the duty for stretcher bearers and musicians behind the line, should they even be present. Anything else, and an entire line can buckle and bend, perhaps even be halted entirely by something so simple as basic human compassion. If one man halts or delays his pace for any reason, it can cause a rippling effect through the line which needs to later be dressed back into place. As such, the penalties for such acts could be harsh or even fatal, as going to the aid of your friend may well represent a direct insubordination in the field, throwing the discipline and cohesion of one's entire unit to the wind. If one man disobeys his orders to fire or to move, and is permitted to do so freely, others might do the same. And for the same reason that men might be ordered to push with bayonets with purposefully unloaded firearms, being to, of course, prevent the men from halting and firing in place out of fear, so too must these men be driven by fear past the broken bodies of their fellows to do their duty. Such is the necessary madness that is linear warfare, something which I think is put well on display in examples such as this one. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.